Particles in a 3D package are a way of simulating numerous tiny objects that act in a dynamic manner. To do this, the 3D package represents hundreds of thousands of objects as simply as possible, so that simulating them is not too much work for the processor, and so that storing the data for each particle from frame to frame does not become prohibitive. A typical particle will consist of a point in space, a direction of travel, and a speed in that direction. However, in this state the motion of the particle is very static and unrealistic. That is, of course, unless you wish to simulate particles that fly off forever in a straight line. So to make simulations more physically accurate, forces are then applied to the particles to make them act like the subject of your simulation. As an example, drag could be used to slow the particles down over time, or gravity could be used to make the particles fall to the ground, or wind could be used to disperse the particles and make them move in a more chaotic manner. Once a desirable simulation has been created, you will want to render the particles so that they realistically represent the effect you're looking for. At this point you can use a number of techniques, such as simple primitives like a sphere to simulate sand, or a volumetric rendering system for smoke, or maybe by instancing an existing scene model to simulate a more complex particle, for instance an arrow. What are particles used for? Well, generally particles are used to simulate any dynamic objects that you wish to have more than, say, 30 of, but don't take this as a hard rule, it's just a guide. They are also used to simulate things like plasma, vapor, fluid type effects, though some of these may be better approached with fluid dynamic systems. Typical uses of particles would be simulating rain, hail, snow, smoke, fire, sparks, a hot plasma, thousands of insects, a volley of, say, 30,000 arrows, or a disintegrating vampire. Here's an example that I produced that shows the use of very basic primitives being used to simulate a dust-like effect. As you can see, this little horn flies into the scene and it's blowing air out, and as it flies around the little statuette it blows the dust off. So as you can see, even very simple primitives, little tiny spheres in this case, can actually produce quite interesting looking results with particles. This example was produced by Alan Mackay for our Afterburner series of DVDs. This was actually produced for the first DVD, which is an intro to Afterburner. What this actually is a volumetric rendering system. It uses ray marching to produce much more realistic simulations of things like smoke and fire. If I play this, you can see in this case he's used it to produce a kind of simulation of steam coming from maybe a pipe in a wall, or maybe it's the exhaust of a car. Another example by Alan is this one, which actually shows Afterburner being used to simulate clouds, and as you can see, it produces pretty realistic effects. Afterburner's a very high-end system. It's used and it's very much respected. It's used in the film industry a great deal, and there are many films that you would have seen this system being used in. It actually works with particle flow, so if you'd like to learn how to use Afterburner, then I can well recommend that you have a look at Alan's series of DVDs and become familiar with Afterburner via them. So, having seen what they're used for, what are they not useful for? Well, generally particles should not be used for simulating larger solid objects. For instance, a common mistake due to the number of objects involved is to use particles to simulate a jar filling up with marbles. In all cases, particle collisions are calculated via their central axis. This is, of course, to keep the particle data, overhead and simulation speed as manageable as possible. But in the example of a jar and marbles, this would mean that your marbles would not collide correctly with the jar's sides and bottom. Here's an example that I produced that actually shows this in action. This was produced using Reactor, and as you can see, it shows marbles falling down through space. They land on an invisible ramp, and in this case they actually fall. Some of them make it into the jar, some of them don't make it into the jar. And as you can see, as they fall down, they hit the jar, bounce off it, hit the bottom of the jar and bounce off, and all the collisions are accurate. This is actually done with a rigid body dynamic system, which is built into Maxis, called Reactor. And as you can see, this has the desirable results. You can see the particles, sorry, the marbles are colliding correctly. So this is a good example of what you would use rigid body dynamics for. Let's have a look what happens when you actually use particle flow to do the same simulation, and as you can see, the results really aren't as desirable. Okay, as I said, this version is actually produced using particle flow, and I'll press play and the marbles fall down, and you can see they land in the jar, and it's just not the same, is it? Let's actually run back through that. You can see the marbles come down, they hit the same ramp as I used earlier, but you can see as they fly through the air, you can see this big marble at the front here is actually passing through the lip of the jar by the looks of it. When it hits the bottom of the jar, it goes through the jar. That's because its actual center is hitting the bottom of the jar, not its outer shell. And you can see that other marbles are actually inside it. This is because it doesn't have actually any volume. It's just a little point, it's just a particle. So you can see that as the particles flow into the jar, they're rendering the same. They look the same as the particles from the reactor system, but you can see the result just isn't realistic at all. And you can see, there you go, this big marble actually goes through the side of the jar. It's very clear there. You can see what's happening. So there you go. Don't use particles for doing things that you should use rigid body dynamics for. Use reactor. It's very capable, and you'll get much better results out of it. Okay, let's move on. A similar situation can arise using particles to simulate water filling a jar. The same principle arises. In the case of the marbles in the jar, a better solution would be to use a rigid body dynamic system, as I've just said, which in Max is provided by Reactor. However, for water in a jar, an ideal solution would be a fluid simulation system such as RealFlow or Glue 3D. In Max, particles have traditionally been catered to with a series of specific particle systems that were geared towards specific effects. However, as of Max 5.1 for subscription members and Max 6 for all other users, the preferred particle system has been particle flow. Particle flow differs from these earlier systems by working with particles in a schematic manner. In particle flow, particles are controlled using forces as described earlier, but also with tests. These tests can be used to check for a wide variety of criteria, and when these criteria are met, the particles can be sent to a new event where they can be acted upon by new forces, or be destroyed, or whatever. Now, let's have a look at particle flow and how it works.